guys, so we're still in the chapter about plants, and so far we've talked about why plants are essential, some basic parts of a plant, and how plants make their own food. And today we're going to talk about some different parts of plants and why pollen is important to plants, okay? So today we're on pages 66 and 67 in our green science book. And we're just going to jump right in, and then we're going to complete a Google form after this. So we've got our title listed, which is parts of a flower. And then we've got a little saying up top that says, although those bright blooms are where new plants begin. So I'm sure that you guys have all seen flowers before and picked them or maybe looked at them when they're growing, but have you really looked at all of the detail in flowers or in plants? Probably not. So today we're going to look and talk about some different parts of plants and what those parts of a flower, why they're important and what they do. So we're going to read about how some plants make new plants. So like all life, plants must be able to reproduce for their species to continue. And we've talked about the word reproduce and what that means. And reproduce, again, means that you're making another form of that species, okay? So in many plants, the flower does this job. The flower produces the seeds that hold the material needed to create the new plants. The key players on, this camera, the cord is in the way. The key players on the seed-making team are the stigma, the pistil, and the stamen, and the little sticky specks called pollen. So it needs all of those key parts of the plant to be able to reproduce, okay? So flowers have many colors, shapes, and fragrances. All that beauty has a purpose. It attracts insects. Many plants depend on insects, especially bees and butterflies, to help them spread pollen. So most of us know that bees help spread pollen. Butterflies do as well, and other insects do. Some birds, bats, and mammals help too. When pollen reaches a flower ovary, a baby plant, an embryo, is formed. A seed develops around the embryo to nourish and protect it until it is ready to grow into a new plant. So it's pretty neat when you actually start thinking about how plants are made because their reproductive system is pretty neat. So here we've got an open plant here, and this plant has been sliced in half so that you could see the way that the parts fit together. So we have the embryo, the baby plant, and it's protected by this. We have the sepal, the stamen, the stigma, and the pistil, okay? The ovary protects the developing seed, and some plants ripens into fruit. Okay, so now let's look at these definitions to really start to understand what each part of the plant is. So we've got the stigma, and the stigma is a sticky tip at the top of the pistil that receives the pollen. So here is the stigma, and I'm sure you guys have seen this before, that collects the pollen, and it's kind of sticky when you touch it. The pistil is the stalk in the center of a flower down which the pollen travels. So this is the pistil, it's that stem or the stalk. The stamen is the part that surrounds the pistil. They are covered with pollen. So all of these little things are covered with pollen as well. Okay, and then we have the embryo. And that's the baby plant that starts as a single cell within a seed. So here's the embryo, and the ovary is all of this that protects the embryo from getting like hurt or damaged or something like that. Then we have the seed, which you guys should be familiar with. That's the package containing the embryo and some stored food surrounded by a cover called a seed coat. So I'm sure that many of you have actually held seeds. Some of them are kind of fragile, while other ones are kind of more hard. Then we have the sepal, and the sepal is the part under the flower that protects the flower as it develops, okay? So if we look back at the picture, you can see the sepal here. Once again, the embryo and the ovary. The pistil is that stalk-like stem that helps the pollen travel down. We have the stigma, which is the sticky part on top that the pollen gets collected on, and then the stamen. Okay, so now let's read about pollen. So we've talked briefly about what pollen was a couple days ago, but we will look more in depth today, and especially tomorrow we'll talk about pollen. So if you look at this picture right here, this is a microscopic view of a pollen grain. So it looks kind of spiky when it's under a microscope like this. And once again, pollen is just a tiny grain-like substance that combines within the ovule to start the process of seed making in many plants. So if we look at this picture of the bee, up at the top, and then the caption, it says, "Don't sweat that bee. It might be in the middle of helping make a new plant." So what that's basically saying is that this bee might have pollen, and it might be transferring it from to a new plant so that a new plant can develop from that. So we have pollination, the birds and the bees. Look carefully at the bee on this page. Does it have a yellow dandruff? Of course not. It's covered with pollen. So you can see, if we zoom back up here, all of this that looks like dandruff or like dust is actually pollen. And I'm sure that around here in the springtime, you've seen pollen before. It gets on top of cars and it makes things have a yellow tint. Sometimes if your windows are open at your house in the spring and the wind is blowing, you might dust off your countertop and it have a yellow residue, which is pollen. And some people are kind of allergic to pollen. Makes them sneeze a lot. So pollen is one of the most important ingredients in the making of a new plant. Seeds are produced by the unit of pollen cells and ovary cells called ovules. As pollen reaches an ovule, the two fuse to form an embryo that will develop into a seed. But how does the pollen get inside the plant? Although birds, bees, and butterflies and other animals can carry the pollen, the best little pollinator out there is the bee. Bees are perfectly designed to be pollen carriers. They have hairy bodies that attract the sticky pollen. As bees buzz from flower to flower, they collect the sugary nectar cupped in the flower. While these nose diving deep into each flower, the pollen grains rub off onto the bees. When the bees fly to new flowers, the pollen gets caught on their sticky stigma. There, the pollen starts to trip down to the ovary, where it begins the process of making a new plant. So if we go back over to the picture or the diagram on this page, so the stamen is where some pollen is, and the bees will land on the stigma and then try to collect nectar from it, and they'll dust off the pollen that they have on them, maybe not knowing, but their wings as they flap will get the pollen down. It goes down the pistil and into the ovary, where then it starts to make a new seed. Let's see. Scroll down a little bit. Not all plants are pollinated by insects. Grass and tree pollen travel with the wind, and some aquatic plants rely on water to carry pollen. But no matter how it gets there, pollen is the key to making a new plant. So, we just read that birds and bees and other insects transfer pollen from point A to point B. But insects aren't the only way that pollen gets transported. If you think about trees and grass, like we just read, they rely on the wind to carry the pollen. The aquatic plants, which aquatic means the water, the plants that live in the water rely on the pollen in the water to get to them. So let's see what we've got over here. So we read the definition of pollen. So here, the pollen gets caught on the stigma. Then it travels down the pistil. So down we go. Each pollen grain then sends out a thin tube that reaches down to pierce the ovary, and embryo is formed. So here the pollen's still going down. In order for a seed to develop, a plant needs pollen. So that is how pollination works. So here we've got a picture of a boy sneezing into a tissue, and the caption says, "Allergy alert." Some folks are sensitive to pollen floating in the air and suffer from allergies. Sneezes ejects the pollen from your nose. So are you allergic to pollen? Does it really bother some people in your family, or does it really bother you a lot? Pollen doesn't bother me, but it tears up my husband's allergies. He's really allergic to pollen. So why do you think that the author included this picture of the bee on the top of this page? Why would he include such a big picture of the bee? Probably to show us that bees are pollinators and they carry the pollen on them, and it's probably to show us that the pollen is getting transferred by the bee. So I'm going to start saying keywords in our videos so that if you watch the video, you will get either extra credit or I will bump up your grades a little bit on your assignments for watching the video. So in order to know that you guys are watching the video, I'm going to say a key word. And the key word for this video is butterfly. Okay? So on our Google form, you're going to see what's the key word in the video, and you're going to type in butterfly. Okay? And I'm going to post those randomly throughout the video. So be looking for those keywords. They're not always going to occur at the end. Sometimes they might be at the beginning or the middle, sometimes at the end. It's just whenever I decide to say the keyword. So it'll be a surprise. So what other role do insects play in pollination? And what other ways are plants pollinated besides insects? So we just talked about that at the very end. If you were talking about trees or grass, how are they pollinated? If they don't get pollinated by insects, how do they get pollinated? All right, guys, so today we're going to do a Google form that's called Parts of a Flower. Once you click on that, you're going to see just a couple questions. I think there's about 6. And once you finish that, you will be done with science for the day. It's always a good idea to go back and check to make sure that you have the work for the rest of the week finished so that you won't have makeup work and you won't get points taken off for your attendance, okay? So have a good afternoon.